yeah, let's move to our third speaker, who is Audrey Morrow from UC Santa Cruz. Audrey is a graduate student there, and she'll tell us about how attention modulates alpha oscillations and activity in V1. Audrey, take it away.
Great, thanks, Doby. All right, so I'll begin by talking about alpha and the C1 ERP, or event-related potential. The C1 ERP is the earliest visual evoked response, and it's considered to be an index of initial afferent activity into V1, or the primary visual cortex. So one interesting thing to note about the C1 ERP is that it results in polarity reversal based on how the activity projects out from the calcarine fissure, such that the upper visual field will actually result in a negative peak, as you see in yellow in the figure, and stimulus in the lower visual field will result in a positive peak, as you see in the blue line in the figure. So a study showed that when participants were passively viewing stimuli in the upper or lower visual field, C1 amplitude was able to be predicted by spontaneous or natural ongoing alpha oscillations. More specifically, strong pre-stimulus alpha power resulted in suppression of the C1 component, as you see in the thinner lines in the plot, whereas weaker pre-stimulus alpha power resulted in an enhanced C1 response, as you see in bold. So this shows us that your natural ongoing alpha oscillations have some modulation over this initial afferent activity in the primary visual cortex. So now we'll switch to talking about attentional modulations. There has been evidence that attention can modulate the topography of alpha power and also the C1 ERP. So there have been a lot of studies that have shown that pre-stimulus alpha power is modulated by where you are attending, specifically where you're expecting the stimulus to appear, as you can see in the figure below. And this change in alpha power topography is usually seen in the parieto-occipital area. So that is a pretty well-established finding. There is one study that has also looked at attentional modulation of the C1 ERP, or rather I should say many studies have looked at it. One study found a really clear attention effect on the C1 amplitude. So if you look at the solid lines, these are for attended trials where the stimulus appeared in the visual field that was anticipated. And so the C1 response is a lot stronger when you are attending to the appropriate visual field as compared to the dashed lines where you are not attending the appropriate visual field. But there is a lot of debate actually about whether attention can modulate the C1 ERP. Another group replicated this study, this Kelly study, pretty closely as far as the methods were concerned, and they did not find an attentional modulation of C1. So our question is, given the role of attention on alpha activity, and then also alpha activity on C1, we're wondering why it's so hard to find this attention effect on C1. So our goal was to use kind of these big, bold checkerboard stimuli to elicit a large C1 response to see if we can get at this maybe nuanced effect of attention on C1. We had participants engage in a contrast discrimination task where they were presented a cue that indicated whether they should shift their attention to the upper or lower visual field with 80% validity. So on 20% of the trials, the stimulus appeared in the opposite visual field. And if you look at the bottom right figure, this is just an example of what an upper visual field stimuli would look like. And participants would respond to which wedge had a greater level of contrast. In this example, they would respond with a left arrow button press, suggesting that the left wedge had greater contrast. And as has been established in lots of the previous literature, looking at attention, participants generally responded faster and more accurately to valid trials in our study as compared to invalid trials. But I will preface everything by saying that we have a very small sample size. We got interrupted by some social distancing guidelines. So as for preliminary results on alpha, we do see a really clear attention effect from the cue. So we can see that alpha topography changes based on whether participants are preparing to attend to the upper or lower visual field shown in blue and red respectively, following the cue, which is the dashed line in the plot. And then the topo plot on the right shows the difference in upper and lower visual field alpha power, and specifically also the electrodes that we examined for the left graph in the parieto-occipital area. And this is showing from a 200 millisecond interval following the cue and prior to the stimulus. So we can see that attention is clearly modulating alpha here. As for the C1 results, we looked at them by subject. The C1 can vary really widely across participants. So we selected a different electrode for each participant, depending on what showed the greatest upper and lower visual field peak. So here are the electrodes listed and then circled in red, all from generally the same area in the parieto-occipital lobes. So these are our C1 responses across subjects. Just a reminder that the C1 is the first peak that you see in red or blue. And the two things I kind of want to draw your attention to here are that the C1 does vary greatly across participants, as you can see from the differences in amplitude. But more importantly, the dashed and solid lines, which indicate invalid and valid cues respectively, are pretty much overlapped. So we're not really seeing much of an attentional modulation depending on whether participants are shifting their attention to the appropriate visual field or not. So even though we're seeing this attentional modulation of alpha, we're not necessarily seeing an attentional modulation of the C1. So just to kind of wrap things up, we definitely see that, as I just mentioned, prestimulus changes in alpha topography are seen when participants are preparing for upper or lower visual field attention. And while our stimuli did do a great job at evoking a really large C1 response across participants, no clear attention effect was seen. So some considerations might be that we have a lot fewer invalid trials, they're only 20% of the data. And we already have a small sample size, so there could just be some noise that could be mitigating some attention effect. Additionally, because we tried to use these stimuli to evoke a large C1 response, they're kind of bold and take up all of the screen. They do leave some of this after image effect on the screen. So we might consider masking them moving forward. The after image might be playing a role in allocating attention or how the C1 is evoked. But generally, even if we don't find an attention effect of C1, it could suggest some interesting things about the properties of alpha. So we did see that spontaneous ongoing alpha oscillations were modulating the C1. So maybe there's a difference in this attentional versus spontaneous alpha and what kind of effect it has on visual evoked responses. And specifically maybe depending on where it's originating from or what the motivation is. So we're hoping to, of course, collect more data in the future and be able to parse this apart. So I just want to thank everyone for your attention, specifically everyone I've worked with and the Neuromatch organizers and all of you for listening.
Thank you, Audrey. That's an applause from everybody. So we have first question from Catherine Duker. And let me promote you to a panelist if you want to ask the question, Karina. In the meantime, I'll just read it. As alpha doesn't seem to have an effect on C1 here, what's your take on the role of alpha oscillations in attention? For example, with regards to the idea that gain modulation by alpha or gating by inhibition.
Yeah, so we've actually looked at a lot of studies looking at alpha and how it might modulate other ERPs or even like gamma lateralization and things like that. There's not really a clear answer. I guess right now we're trying to understand whether alpha might modulate this very earliest visual evoked response. It seems that alpha might be able to modulate some later responses like P1, N1, or even some like decision-making ERPs possibly. It seems like it has some sort of suppression modulation of distractors, but there's a lot of inconsistencies with the research. So we're actually kind of diving into that a little more. I hope that answered your question.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Great. So Marisa Carrasco has a question as well. Could the lack of an effect be related to the fact that the attendant area is so large?
Yeah, that's kind of what we were thinking as far as why we might want to mask the stimuli after presentation. Yeah, they're kind of large, and that could be driving, I think that's definitely driving this big C1 response, because we're seeing almost double or triple the amplitude compared to previous C1 attention studies. So yeah, I guess our hope was that by using larger stimuli, we would be able to kind of look at these possibly minute attentional changes on C1. But yeah, it could be kind of interfering with, like, both upper and lower visual field for valid and invalid trials are getting activated, regardless of attention. So we definitely want to consider masking it when moving forward.
It could be, if I may say so, just that also, rather than just considering masking, you want a task that is more spatially localized.
Okay.
This is a comparative task, so in reality, people have to attend all the upper or all the lower visual field, right? So another possibility would be to do the task to be dependent more locally. So it is
Okay.
one that you would see.
Like maybe farther from the fixation or something?
For example, yes. I mean, there are different ways, but yeah, or not to have necessarily a comparative judgment, but more of a local judgment. That's another possibility.
I see. Thank you.
Very nice presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
All right.
I have a question, but I don't think I can ask it in the Q&A. Is it?
Oh,
can I
go
jump
ahead.
in?
You don't
Okay.
need
Yeah, really nice talk. I wonder how the stimulus that you use in the study relates to the stimulus that was used in the study that found an association between the spontaneous alpha, and the C1.
Yes.
Yeah.
We actually used the same stimuli that they used. We adapted the code to introduce variations in contrast, but actually this top figure was taken from, well, not quite that paper, but it was the same stimuli that were used, and this was cited in a review paper.
I see, interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, part of why I asked, and maybe this relates to the contrast manipulation, is that if you think of like a contrast response function as if the contrast of the stimulus is very high, you might be in a regime where the neural response is saturated and the effective attention won't be very large. But if the contrast was a bit lower, you might be more in the dynamic range of the system where the attention could actually have a larger effect on the neural response. So I just wondered if you have been thinking about contrast or playing with contrast and how it related to those previous studies.
Yeah, so we had the right wedge was a standard at 80% contrast, and then the left wedge would vary plus or minus up to 20% contrast difference, but most of them were pretty close in like to the 80% contrast. But yeah, the stimuli that we used were taken from the passive viewing study. I'm not actually sure what level of contrast that they had it set to, but I know it was pretty high, and we did see that the spontaneous alpha modulated C1, but perhaps, yeah, during attention, it could be modulated differently. So maybe reducing it would also help reduce maybe some of that after image effect as well, and maybe we could kind of parse that out a little bit better.
Yeah, great.
Like having it just a lower, both of them set to maybe lower contrast levels overall. Yeah.
All right.
The feedback.
I actually have a quick question as well, and this may be sort of quite different, but there's a sort of a debate in the field on whether or not expectation, but also attention changes the bottom-up signal, or it's just a later top-down modulation. And I'm wondering whether you think this kind of paradigm can address this kind of question at all, because C1 is actually pretty early, so whether or not you see modulation may actually have a implication for that debate.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what we're trying to get at here. I don't know that I have a good stance per se, but I do think we're trying to assess how far back maybe this top-down modulation of attention can go. But I wouldn't be able to speak on what that would say about bottom-up modulations.
Okay.
Great.
So I see no